the philosophy department at Tulane University. He's been a center fellow with us for the whole semester, and is a returning center fellow. It's been a real pleasure to have him back. Dan, as you know, works in the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience. He works on a very large range of topics such as cognitive penetration, agency, decision making, mechanism, and so on and so forth. He's published in the best journals in the field, and he is finishing a book.
Starting
a book on decision making and agency with a very the breadth of his work on the matter. It's very exciting. Then Wen Wu, who is associate professor of philosophy at CMU, Candler University, or never. Wen is a friend of the center and has been around on a regular basis. I'm sure many of you know Wen. Wen is very famous for his work on attention. Indeed, he wrote what is a classic book on attention. And single-handedly would be a bit too strong, but definitively was one of the main reasons, and maybe the main reason in which attention became again a topic in philosophy of cognitive science. He has just sent his second book to OUP, Movements of the Mind, and that book should be out sometime this summer if everything goes well. June. So that book should be out in June. So we're also looking forward to discuss this book in the coming months. And without further ado, Ben, floor is yours.
Okay.
Thanks again, guys.
Thanks for having us. Thanks everyone for coming. The title, I forget what title is actually in the slides or in the invitation. But I'm going to talk about intention and working memory. Let me just reset my timer so I can. I work in philosophy of action. That's where I started, and I think, not having been involved in classical philosophy of action for a long time, I think we're stuck in a well. And I think a way out of the well is actually to look at what the sciences are doing as a way of understanding the fact that, of course, as agents, we're biological agents. And so a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about is about biology. All right, so this is the shameless self-promotion. Edward mentioned the book. I do want to show it because it's my daughter's photograph that's actually on the cover. And so I'm very proud of that. And so I'm going to go very quickly today about the topics, but if you're interested, it's unpacked in a lot of detail here, as well as discussions of implicit bias, introspection, and reasoning. I think this is a nice way of encapsulating some of the things that Dan and I are going to talk about, which is Durden's ass, but in a different direction. So think of the donkey as seeing the stimulus, maybe from a distance, and when it finally comes into focus and it realizes that it's a threat, it can either run left or right. Dan pointed out that it's running towards the line. That's not the intention. It's actually left or right. And then, of course, from the donkey's perspective, it's like, oh, which ones of these should I choose? Because, again, the Durden case is that they're equally desirable or whatever. There's no difference between them. So one general question is, how do you push the system to go one versus the other? Because if it doesn't, it dies, right? And so that's sort of in the background, a way of maybe framing what we're talking about. Okay, so a lot of you know the standard classical philosophy of action story, which is that beliefs and desires lead to bodily movements. The big question was, how do you distinguish between movements that are things that people do versus movements that merely happen to people, like a reflex? So I'm going to replace belief and desire with an intention. I don't think much is lost by that. And then the idea in the standard story is that when that happens in the right way, the bodily movement is the action. And so this is the story of intentional action. All right, so here are some problems. There are lots of problems with it that people have discussed, but I want to approach it through the biological lens. So here are the problems that I want to think about. One is that intention is a state, and the question about the sort of the metaphysics of causation sort of doesn't really maybe make room in the right way for states. Davidson worried about this, and he talked about the onslaught of states, like the formation of a decision in this case. Intentions then are thought to be like triggers. So again, Davidson, who brought us here, said that, intentions, or the triggering of an intention is itself a trigger for action. And then this idea that somehow there's a separation between these two, that they're numerically distinct. So on his view, again, these are two different events. Okay, so the perspective that I want to bring to the table, again, looking at the biology, is thinking about intention as actually active, we should think about it as an intending, that the causal role of intention is through memory, that is through remembering what one is doing, and that in the end, when one looks at the biological literature and understands us as human agents, intention looks to be really not very separable from action. Now, one way of just registering a complaint is this. No one really talks about perception in the philosophy of action. So if you go back maybe up to about 10, 15 years ago, and you look at the monographs before then, go look at the indexes and try and find entries on perception. And yet perception is fundamental to our bodily movements. All the cases that philosophers have talked about are perceptually guided actions. And so since no one talked about it, I'm just going to take it that we should just entertain lots of hypotheses. And so here's the hypothesis that I want to claim. That perception and movement, like for example, vision and movement, that we know from the visual neuroscience, that there's a visual motor system, if you'd like. Sometimes the dorsal stream is one aspect of it that people discuss. And I'm going to put intentions up here on the top. So they're not, normally they would have been put down here. And what I want to discuss is the interaction, if you'd like, between intention and perception as a way of thinking about our agency. And here are the two main premises, and they're basically empirical premises that I'm going to draw on today. The first is this, that the dynamics of working memory give us the dynamics of intention as we philosophers understand it. And the second is to take on board a growing consensus in the working memory literature that the substrates of the working memory buffer, when you hold on to something, are perceptual representations. All right, so I don't know how many of you work on working memory, probably none of you, or very few of you. Philosophers have largely ignored it a little bit in consciousness through the global workspace. I thought it was boring because, it's like remembering telephone numbers, right? It's like little slots that you put in numbers into. And then I read, this is like the scale falling from one's eyes moment. And I read this book by Miller, Galanter, and Pribram. And this is probably the first, if not close to the first, if not the first, use of the term working memory in English language psychology or cognitive science. So I want you to note what they say, why they introduced it. So without committing ourselves to any specific machinery, we should like to speak of the memory we use for the execution of our plans as a kind of quick access working memory. All right? The point is that it's there to store our plans. In particular, when one plan is interrupted by the requirements of some other plan, we must be able to remember the interrupted plan in order to resume its execution when the opportunity arises. When a plan has been transferred into working memory, we recognize the special status of its incompleted parts, the things that we have to execute, by calling them intentions. Okay, I think this is fundamentally crucial to our understanding of working memory. And it got lost in some sense when we started worrying about working memory capacity, right? And then started debating about whether it's slots, etc. But this, I think, is crucial. So I'm going to rely on this and think about intention as a kind of memory. Now, this is a little bit of philosophical musings. Think about the following. To act, over time, you have to remember what you're doing. And a simple way to think about that is that when you do forget, you disrupt action. This is a common phenomenon. You walk into a room, you're like, wait, what am I doing here? Right? And now, if that happens to you once, it's no big deal. If it happens to you consistently, you will go and check yourself, for example, for dementia. Right? I mean, these are fundamental aspects of agency. So you can ask yourself the question, what am I doing here? Why? And if you can recover your intention, you've got the answer. Right? The memory that you need here is not episodic, like to go back in time and remember the moment of decision. You just need to recover and access your intention. And the moment you do that, you know why you're there and you keep moving. Okay? So that's a kind of rough philosophical gesture at an argument about why intention should be understood as a sort of memory. This is not the normal, typical way that we think about intention in philosophy of action, philosophy of mind. Okay, now connecting the psychology to philosophy, I'm going to make a hypothesis inspired by the Miller et al. Point, which is that, remember, the point about working memory is to store our plans or our intentions. I've just made a kind of gesture and an argument that intention should be thought of as a kind of memory for work. And so the idea here will be this, that the substrate for remembering our plans is what psychologists and neuroscientists study when they're studying working memory. And working memory, if you know the literature, is understood to be an active process of maintaining and rehearsing items. So in that sense, I'm going to make the claim, a proposal, and this is the shift, that working memory now as a psychological or cognitive science construct explains intention and its role in action. And I want to give you a nice paradigm for understanding this, which is the retro-Q paradigm. This is, I think, best developed by Kia Nobre and her colleagues. And so here's the idea. I bring you in, I'm going to tell you that you're going to do the following task. All right, you're going to see two bars, you're going to maintain fixation, you're going to see two colored bars, different colors, and they'll be oriented in different ways. One of those bars I'm going to test you on, although you don't know which, okay? And then I'm going to test you by having you rotate to give me the orientation of the bar. Okay? So when you begin the experiment, you have an intention. It's manipulated by task instructions, and it's abstract. I'll leave out the part about manipulation of the task, right? So you have to remember two bars. And now the stimulus comes on for a very short period of time, 200 milliseconds or something like that. You're maintaining fixation. And what you want to do is remember, i.e. encode these contents. Boom, it goes off. You don't see them anymore. And your hope is now, and this is where working memory comes in, your hope is that you're going to put this into working memory, right? Then you get a cue, which tells you that this is going to be the one that you're likely to be tested on. Or I can make this 100% certain. So in this picture, it'll be about 80-20, okay? So this seems to be the likely thing. And so on their conception, you modify working memory, ignore the selective attention. That's not actually appropriate there. But so you modify this, and there's some transformation during these delay periods when there's no stimulus beyond the fixation cross. And so you might make a modification working memory where you prioritize the blue over the red. If it's 100% valid, that is, you know from the cue that it's going to be this one, you can just drop the red one from working memory, just boot it out, okay? And then you get the little test. So hopefully this is intelligible as a kind of working memory task. I want you to think about this from the lens of intention, what it's like for you as an agent. Okay? So here's the task again. The thing is that you begin with an intention to remember two bars for the task, and I'm leaving that out because it's too long to write. And what are you going to do when you get new information in the world? What I suggest is that you're going to change your intention. There's no reason to keep the objects, the targets, abstractly specified. You can go ahead and focus on those particular targets, right? And so you're going to remember both. Remember, you're remembering both because you have a plan. That's the point of working memory. You're keeping the plan in mind. And let's just pretend that this is 100% valid. You know that it's going to be the blue one, so now you can just intend to act on that one. You can drop the other one from working memory. Okay. All right. So this is the working memory paradigm. Given the Galanter, Miller, Prebraun point, this is a kind of intention-based description of it. I hope you can see that that's plausible given that perspective. Now I want to focus on the neurobiology and look at these delay periods. Now what's really interesting is that people focused in the 70s looking at prefrontal cortex in the macaque monkey or humans. The macaque monkey, what we see here is that this is now the firing rate of these neurons that you're recording from. And so these neurons will have a baseline firing rate here when there's no stimulus on the screen. And then there's an increase in firing if there's an appropriate cue. And what I want you to note is that during the delay period, people notice this elevated delay period activity, right? This sort of keeping active of this neural representation, if you'd like, such that when the response is made, there's a response, and then the activity drops back down to baseline. Okay, you see a similar profile in humans by fMRI. Okay, so this is just meant to be a neural substrate of this delay period, where we're going back to this paradigm here, when you're keeping the thing in mind. Right? Now, what's striking, and this is my second premise, is that when people started looking in the past 15 years with more sophisticated decoding techniques, what they found was that during the delay period, you basically see activity all over the brain. So here's the way I like to do it, say it picturesquely. It's that the brain or you are going to use whatever neural representational capacities are best fitted to the task. And you can get delay period activity as early as V1, primary visual cortex. Okay? So this leads, and this is macaque monkey and also human studies. And so this leads to this idea that working memory, the buffer of working memory, is sensory representations, the sensory motor recruitment account. This is a quote from John Jonides, but here's the basic idea. When you see things, visual representational capacities are going to be kicked in. And the idea here is that working memory should just use those very same capacities to maintain those substrates. Why wouldn't you, right? Those are the best things to do because you're going to use those same capacities again when the target comes back online. Okay? So that's the idea. And so from that perspective, this is like, yeah, that's the way it ought to be, or it's good that it's that way. Okay, now let's go back to intention. What's going on when you're doing that task, or in general? You want to update your plans as the world changes. Right? And in the retro-cue paradigm, the updating is information that you keep track of in working memory. And this is the dynamics that I want to think about. When you're acting intentionally, with an intention, there's going to be an updating of your plan, your intention, as the environment changes. So now I'm going to really try and merge these two ideas back into the retro-cueing task. Think of this remembering here as the remembering that's tied to intending, right? Your plan. And so thought would be the following, right? So you begin with this abstract intention, remember 2 bars. Now you get this new information and you update. I'm gonna act on these 2 bars. So this is part of your memory capacity. And again, a new information comes on board, and this is going to change the nature of that memory state, your intention, your plan, okay, and so forth. So this working memory thing, you might have thought separately as some kind of buffer of objects. And the thing that I want to suggest is that you should think about it as precisely the memory that you have in your intention. Okay? That's the critical sort of shift. The other thing to notice is that given the sensory motor recruitment hypothesis, intention has a perceptual basis. So a philosopher of mind might say something like, oh yeah, those intentions have demonstrative content. But I want to think about it, again, from a biological perspective. Okay, so remember, this is a different version of a slide that I had earlier. This circle is just a node representing a perceptual state. You're seeing something, okay? It's going to be causally related to a response like a bodily movement. So this is vision, it's going to be a visual motor response. And remember, I was hypothesizing that intention is going to be up here rather than as the classical theory has, intention was put down here. Okay? And I want to walk through what is going on for the agent in this sort of task. And I want to remind you of my 2 premises, that the dynamics of working memory give us the dynamics of intention, and that the substrates of working memory are perceptual representations. Okay, so again, just kind of walking through this task, which I hope is intuitive to you. So at that first stage, you're going to begin with an abstract intention to remember these lines for the task. These are dotted because they're not active yet, and there are a whole set of representational capacities for different orientations and different colors, not drawn. Okay, so I'm going to focus on these 2. Now the stimulus comes on. The visual system now is active. That's the solid lines here. You're seeing those stimuli briefly, and then they go off. And the idea is that there's no reason for your intention to stay abstract. It's got more information. It should update. And I'm going to indicate this just by pulling that into the intention. You're intending to act on those 2 things which you're remembering for the sake of future action. The cue goes on. I'm going to pretend this is 100% valid, so you know that it's going to be the blue one. And now you can forget the red bar. It's useless to use, not task relevant anymore. Again, there's an updating here of the intention. Now, what's interesting about this state, think about delayed period activity and neural response across the brain. What's interesting is that during the delay period, you've got to remember this. And what I want you to think about here is to think about intention as a form of attention on that specific target maintained across time. I would call this cognitive versus perceptual attention. But another way to think about it from the perceptual line is that it's a way of being vigilant for an upcoming target that is not yet present. Think about the sentinel on the castle wall who's got to look out for enemies, right? Okay, so you're basically a sentinel in this experiment for this upcoming stimulus, which when it hits, now you can perceive this and you can respond. And I think it seems initially plausible, though of course this is an empirical hypothesis, that being in this state gives you an advantage over being in this state in terms of reaction time and accuracy. That's a proposal. Okay, so this is just meant to kind of give you a sense of how intention is changing as working memory is changing, right? Get my first premise. Okay, so let me now just kind of summarize. I know that was a very quick tour. Again, there's a book. So here's the standard story again. So notice that it is very different, right, from the standard story. It just focuses on this simple connection. And I know causal theorists have complexified this, but this is what I mean by being stuck in a well. If you don't look at the biology as a way of transforming your thinking, getting out of a well and getting into a better place. Okay? So focusing on this sort of angle here, obviously there's a connection here that I haven't talked about, but we've been focusing on this angle. Here are the consequences. First, again, I said that intention should be understood as a kind of active state is not the right way to think about it. So I'm going to say it's like process. It's a process of intending, okay? And that's captured by this updating of working memory as you act. And this action here, part of the thing that it does is that it readies these states so that when the stimulus comes on, you respond. The second thing is that intention as a control state, you might think, its function is precisely because it's a memory. It holds things on so that when the thing appears, you're ready to act. That's the idea of vigilance. Okay? Intention is not a trigger in the classical model. If there's a trigger, it's the environment. The environment, when you're ready, gets you to act. This will be some of the things that Dan talks about that process, as I will say. Yeah, so right, the moment this goes on, boom, that's ready to go, and that's the trigger. Bernard Hummel has this nice phrase where he says intentions are prepared reflexes. And I think there's something true about that. And finally, since Dan also has worked on cognitive penetration, if intentions are integrated with perceptual capacities, then intentions draw on these capacities. And there's an interesting dissolving of this boundary between cognition and perception. If you think of intentions as a kind of cognitive state, after all, they're the products of practical reasoning, and they can be premises for practical reasoning, so that puts them in the space of reasons. Right? Then this idea that to form the intention draws on these perceptual capacities might raise the question about this division that we sometimes draw between cognition and perception. Okay, so the conclusions are, here's the classical model again. I want to say that this is one of the ways that we should change it, that intention is not static but active, that intention is not a trigger but it sets vigilance for the environment to effectively be a trigger, and that intention is not numerically distinct from action. If you think of the action here, rather there's already a tight integration here between these two. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Floor is yours.
It's like Formula One pit stop.
Exactly.
Quick, come on, dude. Losing time.
All right. So thanks everyone for coming. It's the last event of the semester.
Wait, sorry.
Oh, it's like it's a sabotage.
Yeah, exactly. It's gonna blow up. if you say something wrong, I got it.
I'm not going to get a single word out. Okay.
So really happy to be doing this. Thanks to Eduard and the Center for putting this together. I'm really happy to be doing this with Wayne, we've been talking about this stuff or related topics for God knows how long at this point. Ever since Wayne very graciously was willing to engage with me about related topics as a grad student. So I've always been really grateful for that. So I'm going to start out from a slightly different starting point from where Wayne started out. And I'm going to talk about decision making. Now, why am I talking about decision making?
I thought you had the magic touch with it, but
What
it wasn't
happens
working
if you
really.
deny
Just
it?
go ahead and use mine.
Oh, I just had to push it 8 times. Okay, so
You just had to intend.
oh, there goes my argument. I want to talk about decision making because I think decision making is really the crux of the set of things we're talking about when we're talking about intention and when we're talking about reasoning. So when I make decisions, I select between behavioral options. I select them on the basis of considerations of reward, and I use them to guide my action, what I actually do. So decision is also a pretty intuitive category. So if it's lunchtime and you're trying to decide what you're going to have for lunch, and you say, okay, I've narrowed down the options to pizza or salad. There's a range of considerations that speak in favor of one or the other, namely deliciousness versus health, I suppose. But there also might be other aspects to it. So I might need to get into the car and drive to the pizza. I might need to take a long walk to get to the salad, right? So there's also considerations of effort. There's kinds of means end structure to decisions that can all affect what we end up actually doing. So what I'm going to do today is try to get you worried about a set of standard philosophical ways of talking about decision. And this is by citing things such as practical reason. So Wayne talked about this a little bit at the end. Practical reason is generally construed as the conscious cognizing and weighing of one's reasons. It's generally assumed to work on propositional attitudes such as beliefs, desires, and intentions. This is part of the kind of standard model that Wayne mentioned. So the standard story is you go through some practical reasoning, you spit out an intention, and the intention is what guides your movement. So the interesting thing for me going into the broadly speaking, the neurosciences is that the neurosciences just don't talk in any of this terminology. What the neurosciences look for is mechanisms for how certain kinds of psychological processes come about. And there's an open question about how you might think this style, that style of story fits into the mechanisms that the neurosciences uncover. And there's a very nice idea here. Like, oh, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll figure out what intentions are, and we'll do some philosophy about that. We'll go into psychology and neuroscience, and we'll just find the things that we call intentions, beliefs, desires, amongst the mechanisms that are described by the neurosciences. I think most people, probably including Wayne, philosophers of psychology who are interested in action, are broadly hoping for this kind of strategy. But I'm overall very skeptical about it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to kind of broadly go over 3 components of decision making that I take to be well established in the psychological and neurosciences. I'm not going to have time to go through all these in detail. This is kind of like a Charles Whitman sampler of mechanisms from the sciences. But I'm just going to kind of give you the basic idea, talk a little bit about how to scale them up to complex behavior. And I'm just going to point out at the beginning that none of these mechanisms mention anything about attitudes, intentions, reasons, anything, right? So then I'm going to use that just kind of as a backdrop to ask the question. I'm also not going to argue that in favor of these mechanisms. I don't have time today. I'm just going to kind of lay them out. I'm going to assume that these are on the table mechanisms from the sciences. And I'm going to ask, well, assuming that these are telling us something about the nature of the decision-making process, where do the attitudes fit into this kind of process, if at all? So the 3 mechanisms that I'm going to outline are accumulation to bound processes, event files and their relation to plans, and lexical biasing. So in the neurosciences, again, broadly construed, there's something emerging, a consensus that the basic decision-making mechanism in the brain is what's called an accumulation to bound process. So you can think of this as just think of this as a particle exhibiting a random walk or Brownian motion. It's a biased particle, so you can notice it's moving probabilistically, but it's moving slowly in this direction, right? So now imagine we've got 2 such particles, and 1 is a particle voting for option A, and 2 is a particle voting for option B. And what's biasing their movement is information from the environment. So further assume that there's a threshold in the system. Don't worry about how it happens yet. But when the particle voting for A gets to the threshold, you make the decision in favor of A. So in this case, A has evidence from the environment supporting it. You get this biased random walk towards the threshold, and then B doesn't get the similar support from the environment. Therefore, you choose A. So here's kind of the simplest decision-making task you can imagine. Is the predominant motion upward or downward? If you're like me, I say, okay, downward. So how would you model this? Well, you would model this as information about the movement feeding into this kind of accumulation process. So we've got these kind of probabilistic processes, but they're biased from the environment. A is selective for downward motion, so that's getting the evidence boost in favor of A. Eventually, that's going to cross the threshold where B is getting much less evidence, so it never gets to the threshold to be the decision. So this is about as simple as you can describe a decision and a decision process. No one thinks that the process is actually this simple. There's literally dozens of permutations of these models, which involve differences in the accumulation rate, differences in inhibition between the options, things like whether the threshold is fixed or whether it varies, and so on. So I don't have time to go into any of those complications here. But the thing I want to note is that through these models, you can produce really detailed predictions about people's and animals' choices. So you can, by setting the threshold level and the accumulation level, you can predict for a certain amount of evidence the average reaction time to make a decision, because the reaction time will be the time it takes to lead up to the threshold. You can also predict choice probabilities. So given a certain amount of evidence at a certain time, how likely is it that the subject will choose A versus B over a sequence of trials? If anyone bets on sports, this is a little bit like win probability, where you look at the game so far and like, okay, given how the game has gone, how likely is it that the Cavs will win versus whoever the Cavs, Denver? So you can get these really detailed predictions out of these models. Importantly, though, you can also find these models in neural systems. So this is a neural modeling study where basically you're just modeling a population of neurons that are inhibitorily connecting each other. You've got a population that's selected for A, you've got a population that's selected for B. And these are just the results of simulations that show that you can mimic this kind of accumulation to a bound process in the electrical activity of populations of neurons. So again, the standard view is that these models are very plausibly implemented in competing neural populations. There's famous evidence that particular cells in the visual cortex, their firing patterns correspond to a ramping up to a threshold process, which then implements a behavior, in this case, a saccade. You can rig up the kinds of models I was just talking about to reproduce that exact kind of behavior as modeled as an accumulation to bound process. So again, I'm skipping over some details here. The important thing is that you get really detailed predictions from these models, and they're implementable in the brain. Okay, so how do you scale up this kind of process? There's two important things. One, you'll notice that in the perceptual case, you're getting direct evidence from the environment. But in many cases, we're not getting direct evidence for the environment. We're like thinking about what we want in the future. So one thing to do is to broaden the notion of evidence to include things like one's expectations, right? So let's say I'm thinking about pizza or salad. I can kind of project myself and say, okay, well, what is it going to be like? How rewarding is it going to be to eat the pizza versus the salad? And thinking in that way can serve the bias of the decision process in the same way as the external information was biasing the decision process previously. Moreover, you can also just pay attention to one option rather than another. So if I'm paying attention to, if I'm saying like, I'm just not going to think about pizza, I'm only going to think about salad, right? I can bias my own decision process by only sampling from my expectations of salad. And it turns out that if you incorporate these assumptions, you can expand these models to a huge range of decision processes. So the main thing that's happened in the field in the last 15 years or so is extending these to value-based decisions. So here the idea is, okay, I've got to pick what I want, and I'm exactly kind of sampling my own expectations about how valuable those options are going to be. So here's one of my favorite science studies ever. Basically, they brought human subjects into the lab, and they were like, rate all these items on a scale, Doritos, pretzels, whatever, and just rate them. And then what they would do is they'd put the subject into the I don't think there was a box or anything. They just asked them, here's a choice between three of those objects. What do you want? And they showed them pictures of the objects. And what they showed is if you just use that preference list they gave to slightly bias their attention in favor of one object or another, you would get really detailed prediction times out of an accumulation to bound process of exactly how long they would take to make the decision, how likely they were to make one decision versus another. So this is a straightforward extension to a kind of value domain, a kind of preference domain. In really exciting recent work, people have applied this to what I call high order decisions. So you can think about this as deciding how to decide. So in this set of models called the expected value of control models, basically the idea is how much effort should I put into this really challenging math problem, given that I'm not totally likely to solve it, versus should I just watch Friends or something, which is really easy but really high probability of low reward, right? Sorry, not to judge. In my case, it'd be extremely low reward, but whatever. Oh, sorry, this is me trying to figure out how to work my Apple Pencil. But the idea here is basically you've got parts of your brain that are calculating the effort costs and the probability of reward, and you're using those to drive these kinds of accumulation processes. So do I watch Friends or do I try the really challenging math problem? And you can get, given the right setup of the factors, you can get even these really hard choices out of accumulation to bound models. And I've got hopefully collaboration going with Amitai and Megan Peters, where we're going to try to test some of these ideas on more realistic scenarios. Okay, so that's the longest one. I just want to go through a last couple really quickly. So the idea here is that basically what's going on when you make a decision is an accumulation to bound process realized in your head. How do you possibly think about that with regards to like everyday decision making? Well, one thing to bring on board is what Bernard Hammel, who Wayne also cited, calls event files. And this is basically just bidirectional perceptual motor associations. So Wayne was talking about perception triggering action. What this suggests is that you actually have bidirectional associations between those two. So, I mean, the empirical study is just basically have someone do an action, produce a contingent response. After perceiving that association, you can then use the response to prime the action. So you've got a bidirectional association. So it's a really simple idea, but actually, if you combine this into a framework for instance, associative sequence learning, then you can see how this would actually scale up. So, right, so like let's say I reach my arm out, I expect the car door to open. But then, of course, I expect my waist to bend and me to be sitting in the car, right? So you can see how you could kind of stack these things together. Associative sequence learning is a really universal thing. So as Colin taught me, worms do it and so forth, right? And I'm basically a worm. So, but I'm like a robot worm. So it turns out that there are frameworks from robotics and machine learning, particularly partially observable Markov decision processes. And I'm not going to go through these in detail, but basically this is a formal framework for thinking about how you can sequence these over time and generate a sequence of expectations given my action here, given my action here, given my action here, given my action here. So basically, this is how we plan, I think, right? So I need to know that there's a sequence that goes into making a latte, right? I can't end up at latte before milk steaming or shot pulling, right? So we learn these sequences over time, and these can be part of our decision-making process. Why? Well, remember at the beginning when I noted, there might be a drive to the pizza, or there might be a walk to the salad, and I have to calculate costs involved. Well, basically, I think you can, when you're planning, what you're thinking about is an end state. That can be something that is undergoing a competition and an accumulation to bound process. But I also have this entire lead up to that end state in which costs are being calculated and so forth, right? So this is how if we combine this kind of framework with the accumulation to bound models, you can think about an expanded framework for decision-making over time. Last thing, lexical biasing. So people in the literature who are really into propositional attitudes are interested in saying like, oh, well, sometimes you intend to grasp the spoon and then you do it. Isn't that great? Your propositional attitude is causing your behavior. But I've written a lot about this, and actually, if you look at the relationship between lexical representation and perceptual motor representation, the story is much, much more complex. So let's say I say the word snake. What do you look at? Look at the snake, obvious, right? But now let's say I show you this and I say snake. What do you think you're going to look at? You're going to look at the cable. People do it immediately. People do it very strongly, right? So notice about this, like snake doesn't really mean snake in terms of what I look at, right? It means kind of anything vaguely coiled and elongated, right? So I've called this the specificity diversity problem. And basically all I'm saying here is that the most you can get between lexical representations and sensory motor representations is a kind of bias towards a range of outcomes. So why does that matter? Well, what do grocery lists do for us? When you're walking down the grocery aisle, you are bombarded with stimuli, right? And even if you're me, you're trying to walk to the vegetable aisle, but the sign says ice cream, right? And like, oh, cool, right? And you start to get that plan going. Well, if I walked over here, I would end at the ice cream. Now ice cream is part of my decision process, right? It's got an accumulator that's ramping up as I sample the reward of ice cream, right? So what I think lexical representations allow you to do is just kind of keep yourself on track, remind yourself in the way that Wayne was talking about. So I think these three components, accumulation to bound, event files, associative sequence learning, and lexical biasing are all involved in planning and deciding. But you notice I haven't said anything about reason, intention, belief, anything like that. So the question is, how and should we try to glue those philosophical ascriptions that we love so much into this kind of framework? And as I said, I'm skeptical. So just in the last couple minutes, I assume I'm basically at time, but I'm just going to, last couple minutes, go through a couple different ways we might think about attitudes, and I'm just going to focus on intentions. So how might we individuate these attitudes? So we might say they play a particular functional role, or we might say they show up in agents' phenomenology in a certain way. Or we might say they're mechanisms, they're structured in a certain way. I think all of these individuations are present in the literature, and I think they're all problematic. So this guy is, I think, an inveterate functionalist about intention. So this is, I think, is a good quote. By intention, I mean, there's just this broad array of things that are involved in action selection and generation. And then you can flesh out that functional role as Wayne has done in a lot of his work in very interesting ways. The problem I see with this is it's just kind of mechanistically vague, right? So let's say we want to understand the mechanisms of action. Well, where is intention coming into this picture? What is the specific causal role of intention? And where this gets me worried, and to talk to Wayne's presentation, this idea of like broadening the circle of intention and incorporating perceptual information into an intention, but also an intention being abstract and then filled in. I think taking this broad functional individuation approach belies the fact that I'm not exactly sure what that is or how that works, right? So I would want to say, okay, well, what set of mechanisms are you talking about? We might also do it in terms of phenomenology. So it might just be intentions are person-level goals, right? So this is really common in the skill literature. But I think this is mechanistically vague in all the same way. I think if you really think about it, which I have a lot, aspects of all of these mechanisms I was talking about show up in your phenomenology. So think about you're in the lunch situation. You're like, oh, I got to get in the car, but the pizza's so good, right? I think you're kind of like playing out that sequence of events, right, that you're thinking about. But I also think we can intend like a grocery list. I can go, okay, pizza, right? I also think that parts of the accumulation to bound process show up. So if you've ever been in this situation where you really just can't decide whether you want a strawberry or peppermint latte, and it just feels really weighty, and this guy maybe named Dan is just like being super grumbly behind you. Well, if you're ever in that situation, you might notice yourself go, oh, whatever, strawberry, right? That, I think, really closely correlates with the phenomenon of a collapsing boundary, a decreasing decision threshold, which is modeled in a lot of these cases, right? So what is the first person state? I think it corresponds to all of these, many of them, all of them, none of them, I don't know. Lastly, you could go the structuralist route, which is to just say, intentions are propositional representations are lexically structured, so intentions are lexically structured representations. But if all you can get out of lexically structured representations for this process is biasing, then you're not really explaining decision. All you're explaining is a small biasing factor in decision. It's no longer the main driver of your selection of actions. So I think all of the possibilities for individuating the attitudes are really problematic. One thing you might just kind of do is go pluralistic and say, okay, like, yeah, we expect these to map onto a bunch of different notions. I think that's fine, But I think the intuitive pull of the attitudes is so powerful to philosophers that we tend to mix up these different individuations and use the wrong ones for the wrong explanatory purposes and elide different notions of them when we explain things. I should say I think Wayne is better at this than most people. I'm not totally satisfied, right? So I want to propose, okay, if you want to go this route, you need a pluralism with extreme prejudice. Say, fine, use it however you want, but in any particular case, you better tell me exactly what you mean by it, what the mechanism is, and what you're using it to explain. Thanks.
Well, you guys, here we have about 12 minutes.
Okay. Sorry, I did go a little long. My bad.
Actually, no, well, we started a bit late, so just,
Excellent.
I guess I don't need to moderate, right? You're not going to kill each other.
Well, we'll see.
Well, he's not going to kill me.
You were going to start with some...
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I mentioned a little bit with the kind of circle drawing. How does that work? One thing I wanted to ask was kind of like, given that there are these multiple aspects of the process going on and they all seem to be related to action, why do we need a kind of univocal notion of intention such that we would talk about the intention of incorporating new information over time and so forth? Why not just admit that there's a bunch of different mental representations and they all relate to action? And if we do that, it might undermine the motivation for kind of maintaining the notion of intention in the way that you've talked about. And the other one is just if you want to maintain a univocal notion of action, I'm not sure that working memory will help, because working memory shows up everywhere in all kinds of tasks and so forth. So as Javi Gomez-Levin has argued, working memory may not be a natural kind, in which case trying to legitimate intention by gluing it to working memory may be, I know we can talk about that argument.
Cool. So I'm going to ask a couple questions of Dan as well. I'm going to hash it out a little bit. So the first is, why is that decision making a lot of what you said, this drift diffusion? So, and I asked that as a philosopher, right? So philosophers are interested in the weighty stuff, right? I think about things and I sort of weigh reasons. I respond to my environment in a certain way. It struck me that the drift diffusion bits, a lot of them are just in the diagram that I gave, just in the perception motor side, right? It doesn't tell me about the part where decision making enters in for the philosopher, namely the intention or the decision or whatever action representation states. So it seems like a lot of that is pitched at the wrong sort of heart of human agency. And I think from the Phil Cox-Sai perspective that tries to engage with philosophical and sort of higher level psychological categories, it's sort of a mistake because it actually sort of makes it not clear how these two things are related.
Yeah.
And it's not clear even where the intention or those sorts of states come in, even though we have some questions about those. And the second question is a bit more pushy, which is that why isn't all of that philosophically irrelevant? That is to say, sure, at some level, the philosopher just has to cede that some of the questions are causal. Mm-hmm. And, at some point, there's just not going to be philosophical purchase for questions about agency. Of course, there may be philosophical questions at those lower levels in philosophy of science. But if we're interested in agency, at some point, we're just going to get to basic causal mechanisms that just don't have any sort of significant upshot for the kinds of things we care about when we think about agency as philosophers. And so I think those might apply to some of those models. So those are my two questions as a way of just kind of, and these are also to invite you to think about them as well.
Yeah. So do you want me to respond first, or do you want to?
Just go ahead.
Yeah.
Just kind of like, pretend we were at the cafe this morning, mapping out theatrically what was happening.
Screaming at each other. Yeah, good. So there's a reductive element to the project that I'm doing in describing these decision mechanisms. There's no doubt about it. I guess the thought at some level is there must be decision-making mechanisms in the head. I think those decision-making mechanisms are going to be shared with other organisms that also make decisions and use propositional reasoning less and or not at all. So the challenge then for making that identification, that reductive move, saying this is the core decision-making mechanism, precisely is the scaling up question, right? So how do you think about the way we represent options? How do you think about the way we represent um, uh, uh, expected value outcomes and effort costs, right? Such that you can plausibly say, oh, okay, an accumulator for this decision is genuinely tracking the kinds of things we should consider when we think about reasons and so forth, right? So I think it's very reasonable to say that these mechanisms are sensitive to reasons in a lot of ways. They're sensitive to external environment. They're sensitive to changes in the external environment. They're sensitive to the state of the organism and so on and so forth. We're not always aware of its operations, but like sometimes we are, as in the case of the thresholding and so forth. So I guess what I want to say is there's a lot to be learned by making this connection. And I'm less skeptical that I'm much more optimistic about the idea that the explanatory power of this is just going to run out before we ever get to the philosophically interesting stuff.
Yeah, but I guess so. Maybe another way of putting it is that let's say that model is wrong. Which it's possible it could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it gets replaced by another model. This philosophy of science, this happens. The philosopher of agency, person who we might like to engage with to try and convince them, the Davidsonian, is just going to say like, yeah, sure, if it's that model, it's not going to change. It won't really matter what the implementation is for me with respect to the questions that I'm asking about. I guess that was the charge, like at some level. So I'm not saying it's philosophically uninteresting, but we began with this kind of standard approach. And it seems from their perspective, those are just different forms of implementation.
So I guess my thought is, whenever you're positing a mechanism, whenever you're positing a causal process, right? So the standard theory of action is the causal theory, right? You have attitudes, they generate an intention, the intention causes the action. So just like in any other causal process, I'm committed to the reality of the entities that I'm positing.
Sure.
So I guess, and I think that's the reason why, when you look at the philosophy of psychology right now, people who are interested in action are precisely interested in kind of finding the analogs of these states in the causal processes that the sciences uncover. But if there's no unambiguous way to do that, and that the ways that people do that are collapsing different operationalizations, different explanatory roles, then we just end up with a bad picture of the architecture. And that strikes me as bad. And if people aren't worried about that, then I don't know what to say to them.
Can I answer the issue about the?
Yeah, please.
So why univocal notion of intention? So actually, I want the univocal notion to be set operational from the psychologist's point of view, which is that it's the thing that we manipulate in the lab when we give our subjects task instructions. And there's got to be a change in the subject's mind of some sort in that case. And so to the extent that we approach a lot of this empirically, that's the foothold, right? And so I think there is a common variable that we're modulating by giving our subject task instructions. And I also think that once you think that through, because it's a task, it's like, oh yeah, it's something that sets the stage, and that's the new diagram that I gave up. It's something that sets the stage such that when appropriate perception information comes in, you're ready to respond. So I think that's the idea, and it fits a kind of nice functional characterization. It doesn't commit itself to like representational capacities, although of course that can be brought in as well.
Yeah.
So that part I'm willing to kind of be. With respect to working memory, one thing you said is that working memory shows up in lots of tasks, and I say from this perspective, of course, because it's tied to intention and that's or plans, and a lot of your tasks are driven by plans, and so that's not. I think in the end, not a mark against it. Whether working memories, so yeah, I totally agree with Javier's point and your point here that working memory as whether it's a kind or not, I think those are things that are certainly subject to question. So my view about this is, again, like I think about attention, we cobble together from the empirical side the best tasks. We have a conception of working memory, and I want to highlight again the Galanter, Pribram, and Miller point, which is that it is tied to this notion of plan, operationalized plan with respect to task instructions, and then use the best tasks that glom onto that idea. So I think retro-queuing is a good one. I think span tasks, like remembering sequences, I think that's very good. I think the NBAC task, that's a little bit more complicated, and there's some controversy about whether that's really a good conception of a working memory task. But I think if we focus on really good constructs on the empirical end, then I think that does take care of some of these worries.
Really quickly, 2 responses. So I think this is all good. I'm, as some of you may know, I'm much less optimistic about like the constructability of psychological categories that we inherit from folk psychology. So that would include working memory as much as it would include intention, right? So the way this manifests is I'm much less sanguine about the idea that well-constructed tasks single out for measurement precise, delineable, discrete psychological kinds. That's a bigger question. The only other thing I would say in response to the functional individuation point is when and this goes back to the thing you said at the end about dissolving the perception cognition distinction. I'm not actually sure that's the right way to describe it at all. So the way I would want to describe the case is when you tell me to look for the 2 bars, well, I might have a lexical representation, look for the 2 bars, and that's kind of doing a priming thing. And then once I've seen the 2 bars, okay, well, that's the priming got me to focus on these particular 2 bars. And now I'm doing a perceptual thing, which is I'm holding in visual working memory a perceptual stimulus, and I'm using that to guide my action. So the fact that there are 2 things going on there doesn't strike me as a reason to collapse the distinction. It strikes me as a reason to get clearer on the distinction. And what the work I've done on biasing is meant to actually try to clarify that distinction. And just by the way, if you go that route, then the idea of incorporating the perceptual into the propositional is probably not the right way to go. So I think one of the big debates is like I see the functionalism move as kind of in a sense obscuring the architecture, where I want to get super clear about the different interactants, whereas I think you see a lot of advantages to the breadth that you get from the kind of functional individuation.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking, so I started off my talk by suggesting that we sometimes get stuck in philosophical wells. I mean, maybe not this crowd, but the classical account where you get stuck in these wells. Well, not Seth, right? You get stuck in these wells where you're just like, you've got belief desire models, psychological models, and you try and play with really complicated, necessary and sufficient conditions. And one of the answers is something like, oh, other people study agency too. Maybe they've got something to say. And so the transformation here was to say like, oh, it was really interesting that the concept of working memory was introduced to think about holding onto plans, and we've forgotten that. And so I agree with you, Dan, that nothing in this leads to a really good argument that we should dissolve the perception cognition border. However, it becomes a really interesting hypothesis that you arrive at it a different way when you think about the fact that, sure, why shouldn't, when I form plans, I just have more specific representations in my plan? Mm-hmm. And then the idea is that if you add on the sensory motor recruitment point as a thesis, then one way of thinking about it is that these perceptual capacities are the way I represent the target in my plan. Right. And that is a way of getting to a kind of this cognitive state of intention is in some sense perceptual. Now, it's not going to satisfy you if you have other constraints on cognitive architecture, right, which you do. And so I understand that. But it's sort of like an interesting perspective on how this might be dissolved from an angle that sort of, at least for me personally, was opened up by like rediscovering this old literature or this old text that I think no one reads anymore.
I think that's a good place to start. Why don't we take a 2-minute break and then we'll have half an hour for Q&A. Did that.
Worked out.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the timing is right on. Yeah. I went to go cut a bunch of slides this morning.